Clear distinction, right? That's a good way to know
Right.
the difference.
So, and then he would say, always make clear that that was his opinion. But he went all over Italian TV and everything, and the Vatican if they
Never.
didn't agree with what he was saying, they would have told him,
Yes,
stop talking.
stop.
So they didn't. It was still his opinion, but he was somehow sanctioned by the Vatican.
Yeah.
And he passed away a few years ago, but he was a great pioneer.
Yes, there have been many. Like I said, I appreciate you very much, but there have been many. In fact, the last year's program, you had quite a few of the forefathers
who
came forward and acknowledged even those who stood their ground and have passed.
Yeah, we gave the
there has been
posthumous
a great-
award, to
Yes,
Lieutenant Colonel
yes.
Wendell Stevens, who was a great, famous ufologist, and of course, we are connected with him because number one, he was the founder of the International UFO Congress, but also we acquired his files.
Mhm.
So Open Minds now has the entire Wendell Stevens files,
Wow,
and that
that's
includes
great.
his photo collection. In his photo collection, it was considered the biggest in the world, at least in private hands.
Yes.
We don't know what the government may have.
Right.
But in private hands, this man, even though he had been in the military too,
Mhm.
but his official career, his career as an ufologist was not as a military man. Even though when he was an earlier officer in Alaska after World War II,
Mhm.
this is what led him to his interest in the phenomenon. This would have been around, he was a pilot in World War II, and then after the war, there was the Cold War started.
Mhm.
So there was the fear by the military that there could be an invasion from the Soviet Union coming through Alaska.
I remember that.
Right. So they created this project to do a very thorough mapping of Alaska.
Mhm.
I guess to make sure that they knew completely the geography and
Yeah.
everything. We're talking the 40s. They didn't have satellites and all that stuff back then.
Yeah.
So they would send these airplanes to, I guess, to survey, the whole Arctic region. And they were detecting UFOs all the time.
See there.
And then the stuff, the material, whatever they were filming or registering, of course, was put in pouches and sent to Washington, to the Pentagon. And Stevens was there. And so that's what made him realize that this was for real.
So this is a priceless library.
The documents from that project are not in the library because.
No, but I mean in the library that was left.
Oh yeah. So then in the 50s, late 50s, and then especially through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, he became known. He was also working with APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which was a preeminent organization back then, and they were also based in Tucson. And he was their photo expert. And so they start collecting UFO photos from all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And these are dozens of binders that we have, with slides and with prints.
Oh, wow.
Photos going all the way back to, I presented in my lecture a famous photo taken by the director of the Zacatecas Observatory in Mexico, taken in 1883. And this is known as the first UFO photograph. It was taken with a telescope by an astronomer connected to a daguerreotype camera.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the photo is not very clear, considering the technology back then, but you can still clearly see some kind of blot or object crossing the solar disk. But in the report that the astronomer wrote, because visually he could see that in those days the cameras were very cumbersome. It would take a long time to load all the chemicals and all that. So they were only able to get one photograph. But visually he could see it on the telescope, right? So he wrote a report, and this report was published in a famous French astronomical magazine in the 1880s.
Oh,
and that's how we know this case.
Yeah.
So the Stevens collection goes all the way back to that. There are some photos even from the 1920s. Then there's some photos from the Foo Fighter period in the 1940s. That was a term used in World War II.
Yes.
For these balls of light that would follow the Allied pilots.
I know. Right. There's a lot on that. There's a lot of documentation on that.
And at the time, and this is understandable given the circumstances, at the time the pilots would think that these were probably German weapons because they were in a war with Germany, right? And these things were following their aircraft. No, they never shot at their aircraft. If they were German weapons, they would have downed an aircraft. But still, it's understandable that under those circumstances. Now, recently, and I showed this in my lecture too, recently, as you know, the British Ministry of Defense has been declassifying a lot of their. They claim that they're going to release all of their UFO files.
Really, that would be great.
I don't know if they're going to release
Okay,
everything.
can we trust
but,
that?
Well, I don't know, but they've released thousands of pages.
Mm-hmm.
And among these releases, they do a big batch twice a year. And each batch is like thousands of documents. And in one of these batches, there was a famous report, and this made world news. It was all over the world. There was a report that one of these Foo Fighter incidents, but this was not just a little ball of light. This apparently was like a huge, really clear, metallic-looking object.
Wow.
And it was brought to the attention of Winston Churchill, and Eisenhower. Eisenhower at the time, as you know, was the general in charge of the invasion of Normandy. And apparently, it's a second-hand story. It was a fellow whose grandfather had been the bodyguard for Churchill. And he was writing a letter to the Ministry of Defense, to the UFO department at the Ministry of Defense, the one that Nick Pope used to run at one time. And he was telling the story. My grandfather was present at this meeting as the bodyguard of Churchill when this issue was discussed.
Okay.
And Churchill said, this cannot be released. This must be kept secret for at least 50 years. And sure enough, it was kept secret for at least 50 years since we just got it. And this would have happened in 1944 or 43 or whatever.
Yeah.
And also, he also made a comment, according to this fellow, that Churchill was concerned that this also could affect religion.
It just baffles my mind as a researcher and a lifelong scientist. I mean, I seek truth. I don't seek to make people wrong, just truth and fact.
Oh, yeah.
How religion keeps coming into the play, as well as politics. You have these two very, very powerful influences on humanity that's constantly trying to control what it is we learn and what we know. And it's through education that we will become enlightened and evolve to be the intelligence that we are. So it's just such a contradiction to see why they make those decisions, but now they can't suppress it. They can't suppress it.
Well, the politics part is still a little bit more tricky, but I think the religion part, well, I mean, every religion has its own dogma, so you have to see one at a time. I think the Buddhism doesn't have much problem with this.
No.
And even Islam doesn't have much problem with this. Christianity has, because of these problems that we discussed earlier, the original sin and the redemption.
Yes.
Islam doesn't have that problem. So in Islamic countries, actually, they're much more, and the Buddhists accept that there's all kinds of intelligences. But I think the Catholic Church, being such an old institution, and it's become quite savvy because of being around for so long, they find out that they basically came up out of their own experience. I think is the whole issue, of Copernicus and Galileo.
Yes.
That was such a bad move on their part.
That was a catastrophe.
Yeah, it was a catastrophe. And it was even
Historical
more ridiculous because the Bible never did talk about whether the earth was the center or the sun or whatever.
No.
So this was
a contradiction.
This was Ptolemy, who was a Greek astronomer that lived during the Roman Empire, around 300 AD, who wasn't even a Christian.
Right.
And they made it like a Christian dogma.
Yeah.
And so I think they learned their mistake and said, we're not going to repeat this. We did that mistake and it cost us quite bad. And this time we're going to be ahead of the train instead of behind, So.
And it was a one person's perspective that seemed to get, had to rally support from, I'm sure, many who didn't agree with the perspective that it had to be part of their dogma.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well,
so it became a controversial issue historically.
Part of it was that I don't know that there was so much what Ptolemy said or whatever, but I think what the church was concerned at the time was the problem of authority, right?
Yes.
Were you going to accept what the church says at face value? Or in this case was science, right? That was finally getting on their own feet, and that instead of accepting things based on dogma, just because some priest said it or some pope said it, no, we have to do our own investigation.
Right.
Which I wish I would do it with UFOs, but at least back then, although some scientists have,
they have. Yeah. And what's happened now too over the 50 years that I've been aware of all this going on is finally science and church are finding a way to sit at the table together.
Yeah, and on some issues.
On some
other issues.
But at least those little tentacles of possibility are starting to merge in, and in that, they're going to have to accept UFOs.
Yeah.
The
Well,
fact.
UFOs are a reality.
Well, absolutely for many.
The interpretation of why they're here, what's their agenda. I mean, there we can.
There's discussions.
Yeah, there we can discuss, or even where they come from, or are they extraterrestrial, are they interdimensional? I mean, all these things are open.
Yeah.
But the fact, and this is the opinion of the General Bermudez. I spoke with him. That's what he said. He won't pronounce himself as to what these things are, but he will say they're real.
They exist.
Because the evidence is there. I mean, sure, there are many
hoaxes
on YouTube and all that. It's a problem for us, but and there's people that exploit the phenomenon and crackpots and all that.
That's always a small percentage,
and it happens in every field. Yes,
it does. Yes, it does.
So we have to filter that. But once you filter that, there's a percentage.
Yes,
which may be 20% or 15%. Who cares? But there's a percentage big enough. By the time you count the whole world, in thousands of cases that have been logged, that clearly show that there are objects that are not ours, that are technologically superior, that do stuff at their will, that don't seem to be too concerned about our, air defenses or whatever. I mean, they do what they. I mean, you remember the Phoenix lights? I mean,
yes,
that
absolutely.
thing could just cross a whole major American city without fear of retaliation of jet fighters or anything.
No.
I mean, just did it. And in those situations, usually the military are just embarrassed to say, well, we had. So they will, instead of admitting it, they will just deny it or whatever.
Right. And I like Dr. Greer's perspective on things I've heard him speak about, in as much as we're talking about a friendly here. Because listen, with all the advancement of what they have, if they really had come here to destroy us, take over our planet and stuff, all these eons of time that they've been present, we wouldn't exist.
Well, but I'm not so sure that I agree completely with Dr. Greer, though. I mean, I think that there are all kinds.
Oh, I agree with that.
And that's also the case with humans, just that there are friendly humans and there are unfriendly humans.
And there are those with other agendas.
Right, because it's true. I mean, I don't believe in a UFO invasion. If the UFOs were going to invade us, they had the perfect time to do it right after World War II.
Yeah.
When most of the military establishment were destroyed in
Europe.
And the
world was pretty much
could have taken over.
Yeah.
Why wait 60 years, 70 years when we develop all these weapons, right? So on that I can agree with him. But on the other hand, there is a residue of cases, primarily in Brazil, where there are some UFO cases that are aggressive and they're not friendly. So you cannot generalize. And also it's dangerous to say, well, they're all great and they're all wonderful. Look at what happened to the Mexicans when the Spanish came.
That's right.
And I discussed
well,
this.
Historically, in any invasion, in any takeover, any power come to take. But that brings me to another point. Being of some Cherokee bloodline on my mother's side, our people have never, I was raised totally accepting that my ancients, that I am a seed, a root of the ancients, and our ancients are from the Pleiades.
Okay.
So as children, we were raised to accept that we are star seeds, that we our DNA came from another system altogether, Pleiades being a galaxy of its own. So there weren't questions in amongst Native Americans who are still very much in touch with their heritage and their original wisdoms.
Exactly.
In our hieroglyphics, in our symbology and everything else, it's still very present. So what's happening in what you're doing and the work that you're doing is complementing and bringing a lot more of that forward to the fact that I myself am involved with actually being a tablet keeper, to where a lot of Native Americans are approaching the Vatican, and the Tibetans have come forward. They want to sit down with these tablets, and especially the Vatican, who has a storehouse of artifacts. Historical artifacts and tablets that can now be actually investigated, that as far as native and indigenous people, they accept that the ancients left information to help us in these times, to prepare us for certain global and planetary changes. And so that brings me to my next question with you. How do you see all of this fitting into the 2012 prophecies and what's going on in the world as far as the year that we're in, especially this being, I feel, I don't know that you would validate this, but I feel, even what I felt coming here to this one, that we're turning another corner. That a lot of people were saying